Alchemy is among the most frequently referenced and symbolically rich paths of the Western esoteric tradition. Yet it remains to this day also one of the most esoteric and impenetrable. Parsing alchemical literature from the standpoint of research and theory alone can seem a mostly futile endeavor, and this is attested by even seasoned practitioners of this quintessential Hermetic art. I'm Ike Baker, and this is Arcanum. Oxford defines alchemy as the medieval forerunner of chemistry, based on the supposed transformation of matter. It was concerned particularly with attempts to convert base metals into gold, or to find a universal elixir. While this does apply to certain applications of alchemy generally, most practitioners would likely argue that this is a drastic oversimplification. Alchemy is principally a practical philosophy, or a philosophical methodology. It relies on philosophical underpinnings which inform its applications. But before we launch off into the depths, let's examine the history of alchemy in extremely broad strokes. Before we begin, one caveat. Alchemy, like any other branch of the Western esoteric traditions, extends as far back into the mists of time as we are able to see from our own time period. It's certainly not exclusive to the Western traditions, that is, the European Mediterranean traditions. It has an even longer chain of documentation in the East. Some of the earliest records of it go back to the ancient Taoist writings of China. That said, it would be truly impossible to endeavor a full-scope historical investigation into the times, cultures, and personages involved in its evolution and transmission in a single episode. So, as always, if I leave out someone or some period which you thought important, mea culpa. It is more than likely that lots of uncovered ground will be thoroughly explored in our further discussions and presentations on this channel. While the actual origins of the art of alchemy likely remain lost to historical documentation, the etymology of the word alchemy itself reveals its early relationship to ancient Egypt. Egypt was called Chemia by the ancient Greeks, with whom they were in close contact. Even in that remote period, the Greeks considered Egypt a source of ancient wisdom, as they were a very old and advanced civilization. There are various ideas and interpretations put forth concerning this root chem, as it has multiple meanings and connotations in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and ancient Greek. Generally, we can take it to mean relating to Egypt, as Egypt was called Chemia by the ancient Greeks, which was likely derived from the Egyptian hieroglyph Khmi, denoting the black earth, the dark, rich soil made fertile by silt deposits from the overflow of the Nile River. This Egyptian connection is important because of what we understand of the Egyptian worldview of that time. To the ancient Egyptians, everything was a species of magic. The motions of the planets and stars, the natural processes such as the regular overflowing of the Nile, bringing a rich bounty to the benefit of the people, the miracles of the gods and the triumphs of the heroes. It was impossible to separate a mystical spiritual perspective from their material reality. The ancient Egyptian word Heka was used to denote magic, and it is the root of the name of the Greek goddess of magic, Hecate. The Egyptians also conceptualized Heka in the form of a goddess, who was among the deities that traveled on the bark or boat of the sun god Ra. The inclusion among this entourage of deities implied that Heka was an integral aspect of creation and its cycles. It is this worldview that informs the philosophical underpinnings of alchemy, a spiritual cosmic holism. There is evidence that it was the ancient Egyptian priest class that began an investigation of the hidden properties of nature, being divided into different hierarchical castes or positions, forming a kind of insulated clerical society of its own. One such among these being a proto-scientific metallurgy. It is from this early scientific examination of the properties and manipulation of metals that operative alchemy has likely stemmed at least in some part. Another relevant aspect of the ancient Egyptian priest class were early medicine priests. It was the purview of these medicine priests to formulate balms, ointments, and preparations which were then meant to be coupled with prayers, supplications, and various other magical spoken and ritual formulas for the healing of the sick. In the ancient Egyptian conception, a human being was of a composite nature, having a physical body as well as other more spiritual or rarefied organisms which interpenetrated the physical body and each other. Each of these bodies had specific medicinal requirements and preparations. The duties of these priests also extended to the crafting of embalming fluids and other mummification preparations, including medicines which would be buried with the pharaoh in his tomb, as well as medical hieroglyphic formulas inscribed about the burial chamber. Overall, the investigation of nature and her forces were the special focus of the priest class as a whole. Interestingly, our word nature has its etymological roots in the ancient Egyptian word for the gods and goddesses, netyer, in the singular, and netyeru in the plural. In this sense, the operations, experiments, and knowledge gained by the explorations of that priest class enabled human beings to participate in and avail ourselves of the divine magic that created, maintains, and sustains the visible cosmos. The significance and importance of the alchemical worldview would be further amplified and elaborated in the cultural synthesis, or coagulation, of the Greek and Egyptian worlds under the Roman Empire in the early centuries of the Common Era. It was during this time that Hermetism began to come to prominence in the philosophical and religious communities of Alexandria and related cultural centers. At the conjoining of these three great ancient civilizations, primarily in the Egyptian city of Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great, who conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, bringing Greek culture and installing Greek rulership in the seat of the pharaohs, that the syncretism of each pantheon's respective god of mental, intellective processes took place in Thoth Hermes Trismegistus. This single representative, who would later morph into a quasi-historical, if not legendary figure, was the conjoining of the Egyptian scribe god Thoth and the Greek messenger of the gods, Hermes. Now, the Roman concept of Hermes was Mercurius, or Mercury. This is significant because it was this personage, Thoth Hermes Trismegistus, that a group of texts were attributed to. These are now known as the Corpus Hermeticum. Central among these was the Emerald Tablet. This text will figure preeminently in the theory portion of this introductory series. Hermetism is considered to be the foundational philosophy for later applications and conceptions of alchemy. In fact, alchemy has been dubbed the Hermetic art, implying perhaps that alchemy is an exemplar of the practical applications of Hermetic thought. During the Hellenistic period, the literature of the ancient world, or at least the ancient Mediterranean world, was collated at the Great Library of Alexandria, including the Hermetic texts. It was in this academic, philosophical, and religious milieu that alchemy and Hermetic philosophy became supplementarily conjoined as a path of spiritual transmutation and natural investigation. In hindsight, this was a precursor to modern evolution, but a conscious evolution. The great break in the textual chain of the West came with the destruction of the Library of Alexandria and the burning and diaspora of many alchemical and philosophical texts. It is also important to note that the Greco-Egyptian alchemical tradition was informed by Greek or Empedoclean matter theory. This was the idea posited most famously by the Greek philosopher Empedocles in the 4th century BCE, that everything was composed of four elements: earth, air, water, and fire. Without this basic yet at the time revolutionary concept, alchemical philosophy as we understand it could not have been established. The earliest attested alchemist emerged from this period, as primarily referenced in the works of the 4th century alchemist and philosopher Zosimus of Panopolis. She is known as Maria or Mary the Jewess, Mary the Copt, and Mary the Prophetess. In the Arab alchemical tradition, she became known as the daughter of Plato, which was also a term referring to the alchemical substance of white sulfur. Zosimus of Panopolis was an ancient Hellenistic alchemist and Gnostic mystic. born in Roman Egypt during the end of the 3rd century. He wrote the oldest extant books on the practice of alchemy, which he called kairok meta, meaning things made by hand. At this point in time, the word chemia or chem was rarely associated with what we understand to be alchemy. Zosimus's work, consisting of several commentaries of other ancient Greek philosophers, contained vivid, dreamlike imagery approximating surrealism, and all manner of allusions to processes both material and symbolic. Therefore, we see that even at this early date, alchemy was veiled in allegory and symbolism. It is in the work of Zosimus that we find a combination and correlation of the transmutation of metals and a transmutation of the body and soul. He drew this from Gnostic and Hermetic sources available in his day. He also wrote several commentaries on the writings of natural philosophers who were types of proto-alchemists and sorcerers just before his time, such as Volos of Mendes and the legendary Persian sorcerer-alchemist Ostanis of Mendes, fabled to be the personal alchemist of Alexander the Great, though this is debated among historians. It is from the works of Zosimus that we inherit the concept of the philosopher's stone. It is also from this early Greco-Egyptian period, around the 4th century BCE, that alchemy begins to take on its distinctive designation specifically as the transmutation of metals. At around the end of the 3rd century CE, by decree of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, all alchemical texts and materials were to be burned and destroyed, on the fear that the fabrication of gold could destabilize the Roman Empire. Under Emperor Constantine, Rome became officially a Christian empire. And by 391 CE, the Emperor Theodosius ordered the closure and destruction of pagan temples, texts, and statuary. By the middle of the 5th century CE, Rome was in irreversible decline, and the known world seemed to be reeling toward an end. In the time between the anti-pagan edicts and the fall of Rome, the alchemists, Hermetists, and other pagan philosophers began fleeing the once hospitable Mediterranean cultural center of Alexandria and seeking refuge amid the Arab world, which was markedly tolerant at various stages, particularly as concerned philosophy, education, and ideas. It is from this period that the Hermetic art is formally dubbed alchemy. Al being the Arabic prefix for the, and chemia being the Greek root for the Black Land, or as it came to be understood, art of the Black Land, or the Black Art. Although there are at least half a dozen other posited origins for the Greek derivation of the root word chem or chemia, the one given here is by and large the most accepted. During the medieval period in the Arabic world, several great alchemists came to prominence. This era is so compelling it deserves its own episode. Among these was such a figure as the great and quasi-mythical Jabir ibn Hayyan, known to the European world as Geber or Geber, to whom is attributed over 1,000 works on alchemy, some of which were written in so cryptic and obscure a style that we derive the modern term gibberish from this corpus of alchemical treatises. However, within these works, many of which are now believed to be attributed, are the first known systematic classifications of chemical substances, as well as the oldest method for deriving an inorganic compound. It is also Jabir who derived the alchemical theory of mercury and sulfur from Aristotle's ideas on the formation of minerals and metals. Another of the great minds, not only of the Arab Empire, but of history in general, was Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna in Europe. He was a polymath of the Islamic Golden Age who wrote and taught extensively on just about every science as was available in his time, producing 242 scholarly works and commentaries which have come to us. He famously collated a canon of medicine which contained materia medica with compound formulas numbering approximately 750 different kinds of medicine, including plants, minerals, and other substances. He wrote treatises on alchemy as well, in which he attempted to use an Aristotelian rationalism and division of the compound elements to illustrate the transmutation of metals. The Arabic world became the connecting historical link, assiduously preserving and elaborating alchemy and Hermetic philosophy to later transmit it back to the European world. It was also at this time that astronomy and astrology were being developed, cultivated to an extremely refined degree in the Arab Empire, and the science of the stars was indissolubly bonded with alchemy, forming an observable and practical link between the starry rays and motions and earthbound materia, exemplifying the relationships of macrocosm and microcosm most notably developed in Hermetic and Platonic philosophies, of which, again, the Perso-Arabic civilization was the nearly sole custodian at this time. A decisive turn in the trajectory of alchemical practice came in 1144 CE with the translation of the Arabic Risalat Marianus from Arabic into Latin under the title Liber de Compositione Alchemiae. During this period in Europe, much of the lawful or sanctioned study of pretty much anything was of necessity carried out by the special purview of the doctors of the Church. Quite a few of the more brilliant and adventurous Christian theologians and scholars of the time contributed tremendously to the various arts and sciences to which they committed their researches. A few of these included Albertus Magnus, or Albert the Great, and Thomas Aquinas, his student, both Dominican friars and Catholic priests, as well as Roger Bacon, a scholar and Franciscan friar, all of whom lived and worked in the 12 and 1300s in Europe. These men of letters of the Church all held alchemy as a science worth serious consideration and investigation. Albertus Magnus was a great practitioner and experimenter, as well as a teacher who focused on the study and classification of minerals. St. Thomas Aquinas, a student of Albertus, examined alchemy thoroughly in several treatises, focusing on the question of whether gold produced by alchemical methods could be sold as real gold, coming to the conclusion that yes, it could if its properties were the same as naturally occurring samples. Roger Bacon went so far as to emphasize that alchemy was by far the most important science that one could investigate. He was a prolific laboratory alchemist, sharing formulas for such compounds as gunpowder, as well as powerful elixirs and tinctures. Giordano Bruno was known to have given public lectures on the principles of the Emerald Tablet, and to have expounded on the universe as composed of alchemical influences. Several alchemical treatises were attributed to the Christian apologist and theologian Raymond Lull, but this collection of literature remains unsubstantiated as verifiable works in the Lullian corpus. After the fall of the Arab Empire with the Mongol siege of Baghdad in 1258, Hermetic, Platonic, and mathematical and alchemical texts began making their way back to European consciousness. One of the ways in which it did this was the route of Al-Andalus, the Islamic Moorish civilizations in southern Spain, particularly in the city of Córdoba, as well as by way of similar influences on the Mediterranean island of Sicily. In part, this spread was also assisted by small cadres of Orthodox monks who translated key Greek texts into Arabic, to be preserved amid the largely alchemically tolerant Arabic Empire. The Arabs did also have some alchemical cross-pollination and influence from the Orient as well. That's worth noting. In the interim period of the Middle Ages in Europe, alchemy had begun to be touted as pure fraud and charlatanry. In 1310, Pope John XXII issued a bull prohibiting alchemy, and in 1404, Henry IV, King of England, issued an act banning the practice of alchemy, and more specifically, again, gold-making. It wasn't until 1463, at the behest of the great patron of the Renaissance, Cosimo de' Medici, that the Corpus Hermeticum was fully translated from Greek to Latin by translator, scholar, and Renaissance Platonist Marsilio Ficino, effectively opening the doors to the Italian philosophical Renaissance. A revolution in the art came at the beginning of the 16th century, with the work of a man named Philippus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, or Paracelsus. Paracelsus was born in the Swiss countryside, the illegitimate child of a local physician. He would grow to become not only one of the most brilliant and successful, in terms of curative success rather than purely financial, healers, physicians, and philosophers of his day, but also a pioneer of medicine and pharmacology unto the present day. He was also a somewhat controversial personage in his own sphere of influence, having died under mysterious and ominous circumstances, being found dead by blunt force trauma to the head at the White Horse Inn in Salzburg. Paracelsus's significant contributions to the alchemical traditions were several. Arguably among the foremost was the introduction of what he called spagyria. Paracelsus admonished alchemists to broaden their scope of practice and abandon the transmutation of metals to gold, and rather use the application of alchemical philosophy and principles to the production of medicines for the healing of the sick, a remedial application of alchemy. The pharmacopoeia Paracelsus collated for the work of Spagyria was not confined, however, to plant materials. Rather, it included a vast array of materia, including minerals and metals as well. Paracelsus also classified disease into 5 causes. These were ens astrale, or disease by stars, that is, astral influences; ens veneni, disease by toxicity, or impurities and blockages; ens naturale, disease by nature, constitutional disposition; ens spirituale, disease by or of the spirit. This is largely associated with psychological or nervous pathology in the modern time. And ens dei, disease by God. This is disease by inevitable causes, fate, karma, unforeseen and largely unpreventable. The works of Paracelsus relied heavily on the mystical and magical worldview, as opposed to the strictly Aristotelian model other more scholastically trained alchemists before him had adhered to. Paracelsus once wrote, "That which lives on reason lives against the spirit." He incorporated a large base of metaphysical and natural magical practices into his preparations and workings, such as Kabbalah, astrological magic, and Christian mysticism. One of the ways in which Paracelsus made himself pretty unpopular among some of the more relevant medicinal and natural philosophy communities of his time was by chiding, mocking, and correcting the astrologers of his day, all of whom subscribed mostly to a tropical model of astrology, whereas Paracelsus insisted that the influence of the stars were unremittingly dependent upon their positions in the sky relative to earthbound bodies. In other words, Paracelsian Spagyria uses sidereal astrology. For more on these terms, sidereal and tropical astrology, check out the introductory astrology videos that I've posted. Lastly, and importantly, Paracelsus added the third philosophical element to the alchemical theory. Whereas Jabir formulated mercury and sulfur, Paracelsus added salt, giving us the tria prima, salt, sulfur, and mercury, the basis of alchemy and its philosophical art. For those who may be interested, to my mind, there is no finer introduction to the subject of Paracelsian Spagyria in the modern day and its fundamentals than the free course offered by the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy. A link to their website is provided in the section below this video. You've got to check it out. A definite subject for a future standalone series is the Invisible Brotherhood, the fraternity of the Rosicross, the Rosicrucians. These anonymous 17th century philosophers, scholars, and Christian mystics contributed to the preservation and transmission of the alchemical arts. The Rosicrucian tradition, even in its reconstructed forms of orders and societies in the present day, is by and large a society steeped in symbolism. It is, in fact, absolutely paramount to emphasize the symbolic nature of the alchemical tradition, which we see exemplified in the earliest alchemical works of Zosimus and the cryptic and obscure verbiage of the Emerald Tablet. The Rosicrucians taught by emblems and symbols, and transmitted an extensive amount of esoteric and occult tradition and wisdom by this extremely effective manner of communication. As is stated in the 16th century alchemical treatise, the Rosarium Philosophorum, or the Rosary of the Philosophers, quote, "Whenever we have spoken openly, we have said nothing. But wherever we have written something in code and in pictures, we have concealed the truth." By the end of the 17th century, alchemy was considered debunked in Europe, along with its sister science, astrology. This was the beginning of secularized science, aka the Enlightenment, and inevitably the automatic inculcation of a predominantly secular worldview to the masses. The vivifying spirit of the holistic sciences had been removed almost surgically, violently even, and what was left was the insistence of the sole reality of its corpse, dead reductionist materialism. The cadaver of the greatest heights of human achievement paraded forth for generations as the absolute dismal reality, which all reasonable humans must invariably accept in order to be considered noble and sane. Yet there have been, are, and will always be small pockets of dedicated practitioners, quietly, diligently, persistently, courageously even, doing the work. In the 1800s, with the rise of spiritualism and following the explosion of European Masonic orders, the French occult revival of the 1700s, and as a direct consequence of the void left by not only the collapse of the Theosophical Society, but that same society's inherent exclusion of the Western traditions in favor of the Eastern, alchemy once again rose to quiet prominence among a small but influential and extremely industrious crowd in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, whose chief alchemist was the Reverend W.A. Ayton. The Rosicrucian Masons who formed the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn soaked nearly every gesture of their ritual, every line of their symbolic imagery, and every letter of their curriculum in alchemy. Yet theirs was a spiritual focus, rather than a merely practical laboratory alchemy, at least among most of the members. However, the practical work was not looked down upon. With the passage of time, that changed, and many initiates of Golden Dawn successor lineages became skeptical of the literal interpretation of alchemical symbolisms, including Israel Regardie, who was a longtime skeptic of the art in its literal form until meeting a man named Albert Rydell, better known as Frater Albertus. More on him later. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and its vast curriculum, ritual system, and aggregation of nearly the entirety of the symbolic vocabulary of the Western esoteric traditions was a seeding point that led to an explosion of offshoot orders and solo practitioners, as well as an occult literary renaissance. In the early 1900s, alchemy began reaching once again into the academic domain by way of Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung. Jung very famously repopularized alchemy from an academic and modern quasi-materialist psychologized perspective. His work went a long way to connect the interior processes of human psychology to the effect produced in the material, and is not without tremendous value. However, hearkening back to the Prisca Philosophia, the pristine or first philosophy, spirit and matter are intertwined, and each physical, even psychological cause bears out a necessary and inevitable spiritual effect, and vice versa. The spiritual consequences were not specifically borne out by Jung, as it was not his especial and professional field of knowledge and influence. Israel Regardie, an initiate of the Stella Matutina, a successor branch of the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and who famously, or perhaps infamously, copied the rituals, lectures, and curriculum of the orders up to a certain degree, and then published them in several widely read volumes, also became a psychotherapist and further combined esoteric principles and psychology. Modern alchemy arose with the advent of two figures. German-born alchemist Dr. Albert Rydell, who would found the Paracelsus Research Society in Salt Lake City, Utah, and the French alchemist and philosopher Jean Dubuis, who would found the Philosophers of Nature. The work of these alchemical educational institutions, as well as the materials on alchemy offered by Amwork around the same time in the 1980s and 90s, served to jumpstart serious work with Kabbalistic philosophy and practical alchemical laboratory work. With the Paracelsus Research Academy and its commercial offshoot Paralab, Frater Albertus helped to train a new generation of alchemists, including Robert Allen Bartlett and Mark Stavish, as well as offering a large amount of quality alchemical literature to the interested public. The focus of the Paracelsus Research Academy was an emphasis on the spagyric application of alchemical philosophy and processes, or spagyria, that Paracelsus had labored to create and offer as a balm to mankind. In the modern day, alchemy is extremely popular, if at least as a branding term, with all manner of bath and body products claiming to be alchemical or appropriating alchemy as a buzzword in their marketing. Yet, there are modern alchemists still persistently and diligently pursuing the real work, if only slightly less quietly thanks to social media. These alchemists are the latest generation, at the fore of experimentation and contribution to the alchemical art. Which alchemists are you most upset that I left out? Nicholas Flamel? Edward Kelly? Manfred Unius? Brian Cotenoir? What aspects of alchemy are you hoping I'll get to in the next video in the series? What do you consider to be recommended or required alchemical reading? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. If you've enjoyed this video, I hope that you'll consider subscribing to the Arcanvm Patreon. There's a link to that page below, or a one-time donation to help me to continue to produce free, rigorously researched, and practiced material like this. Join me again in the next video where we'll be diving deeper into the history, theory, and practice of this and many other similar topics. Thanks for watching. In Luke's.